Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone, indeed. This is a conversation I have been anxiously awaiting and looking forward to for quite some time. With me today is, I think, my friend, I would say on X virtually, and now in person virtually, Stelios. If you don't know Stelios, maybe you know him from his and I back and forths on classic liberalism and our points of philosophic agreement. But maybe Stelios, you could do my audience the courtesy of giving yourself a brief introduction, so that if they're not familiar with your work, they know who you are and where to find you.
Yes, of course. Thank you very much. So my name is Stelios Panayotou. I understand that many people have trouble spelling my surname, and that's also on our end. You see that we only wrote my first name. So people can find me on X and also on the podcast of the Lotus Eaters, where I am a host. Frequently, I appear on the podcast on a weekly basis. Right. So my background is in economics and philosophy. I studied business administration, marketing, and also did more economic stuff. Then I went into the philosophy of economics, and especially the Austrian School of Economics. And I fell in love with philosophy. And then I also fell in love with the notion of liberty within the tradition. And I wanted to get a very strong intellectual foundation on my thinking about it, because I come from Greece and we have some various anti-liberal strains in our culture and especially in our politics. And that's where I very much got into it. That's why it interested me the most. And I'm very much a classical liberal ever since. Then I went to philosophy, as I said. I did a PhD in the philosophy of free will, which I think really ties into politics in ways that lots of people forget, because they focus only on the economic aspect or the strictly political one. But I think that there is a deeper one. There's a very deep ideal into what it is that it means to live as a free being. I think that this is especially something that progressive, within quotation marks, or social liberals are missing. So I was at the University of York. I was a lecturer for a bit. I taught for 6 years, also was studying for a PhD. And then I left academia because academia is not particularly sensible. And it's a nest of, you'd say, leftism, and of a very insane type of leftism. And I came here to the podcast of the Lotus Eaters, which is a free speech platform that is primarily anti-woke. So here I am. People can find me on X and also on the podcast of the Lotus Eaters. I'm sure we can send a link afterwards and tie a link after to this. So I'm very much pleased to be joined with you, to be joining you here. And yes, we have spoken online, and also I've seen stuff we've commented on each other and replied to each other, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Thank you so much for that. And for those of you in your audience who don't know me, my name's Ryan Mullally. I am a former teacher. I got a philosophy degree as my undergrad, then went on to get a master's in education, then left education, became a lawyer, and have litigated at every level of the U.S. legal system, including the U.S. Supreme Court. And I would say around the time of my first child's arrival, I started getting a little dissatisfied with my understanding of the world and our politics, and started re-examining a few questions. Some of them, I think, were the kind of grounding philosophical questions that you and I might discuss today. And how would I teach my daughter these things? And at the same time, U.S. politics was changing quite a bit with the ascendancy of Trump and the ascendancy of radical subjectivism and radical woke politics in America. And I came to realize that I had something to contribute. And though at the time, speaking publicly was very dangerous for a professional because there was a very serious risk of cancellation. Over time, I overcame my fear and started doing political debates. I've debated people like Destiny and Pisco and other names on the left. And now I host a channel called Natural Law with Ryan Lally, where I talk about classic American liberalism, classical American philosophy, which is inextricably interwoven with these same concepts, and law and politics. So I think the short version of that is that you and I have a tremendous amount in common in terms of our philosophic tradition, and I think maybe that might be the right place to start, because so often what we do is we spend time talking about why we disagree with the woke, why we disagree with the post-liberals and the progressives, but oftentimes what's lost is the true definition of classic liberalism and what that actually means. So if I was going to ask you that question, like you're in an elevator, you have a short pitch, you're going to try to explain to someone who doesn't know anything about this, what really is classic liberalism? What would you tell them?
I would say that it's a political tradition that is about 4 centuries old, a bit older than that, accompanied by various philosophical strands, which we're going to discuss, which manifests in the pursuit of the following goal. The classical liberal wants as much freedom as possible for each individual and wants to limit that freedom with the equal amount of liberty for every other individual. In a nutshell, my freedom ends where your begins, and your freedom ends where my freedom begins. And there is a push for expanding that sphere of liberties and wanting the equal liberty for every individual. Now, in pursuing that goal, there are several calls for things across different levels. In politics, this manifests in terms of a further call for the rule of law instead of the rule of persons, and for constitutional government, for checks and balances in the executive, especially in the executive branch of power. In economics, it manifests as a strong desire and advocacy for property rights and trying to reduce taxation as much as possible, while also wanting to maintain wanting to prevent a sort of anarchy, in a way. And you could say that in social matters, it calls for a free and vigorous civil society that is free from state intervention and coercion, but also involves a civil society that on its own tries to exert moral pressure upon each other. This is something that isn't particularly discussed. It's a feature of the classical tradition, and that is being neglected later on. So in a nutshell, I'd say this is a good way to think about it. And if you want to put it philosophically in a way that captures as many strands of classical liberal thinking as possible, I'd say it is a political tradition that holds liberty to be either the fundamental political value or one among the fundamental political values.
I think this is a wonderful definition. And I see, by the way, just to put the bookmark down, a few people are leaving questions and comments. If you have questions, I'm going to do them at the end. So please feel free to put them in, but I'm not going to interrupt the conversation midstream. And maybe we can do a little Q&A at the end with the questions and comments that come in from the audience. So there's a lot of directions that I kind of want to go from there, because I'm in total agreement with you. But the one I want to focus on first is this point that you made about the moral role of civil society, which I think, to me, this is where we went astray, because purposefully or by accident, and we can talk about why that is, classic liberalism got equated with infinite permissiveness. That, just because I don't think the state should come in and stop you from doing something means that I have no opinion on the matter. And the way that I describe this to people is in America, we have a strong tradition of free speech. And as a result, you have the legal right under the First Amendment to burn your own American flag in your own backyard. This is a constitutional guarantee. It also makes you a bad person. And just because I, as a lawyer, will defend your legal right to do it, and I would defend you from the government were they to intercede and stop you, that does not mean I want to associate with you. It does not mean that I have to bless your, lack of patriotism and sacrilege towards our country. So this is a moral issue, and just because I don't want the government policing it doesn't mean it shouldn't be policed. It just should be policed by us, and that we should hold ourselves to this standard. And the reason I would put it is that in order to maximize liberty, you have to have a common moral foundation, because if you give increased liberty to an immoral people, they will use it for immoral ends. In order to have ordered liberty, you must have a shared morality. And at least to me, where classic liberals have gone astray, I'll use scare quotes, where classic liberals have gone astray, is that they have equated classic liberalism with this infinite permissiveness, and that it's that infinite permissiveness that leads to the degradation of society, not the classical liberal principles themselves. But I don't know how does that land with you?
I agree with you. And you raise many points that I want to touch upon. And I want to say that fundamentally, classical liberalism is a sincere tradition in the following sense. It recognizes its own limits. This is what made George Washington different to Robespierre. He was given immense power, and at some point he said, I'm not comfortable with that much power, because he had, in a way, the ancient classical ideal of philosophical thinking about it, which involves awareness of one's own limitation. This is where people go astray, because I'm reminded, I'm going to take a detour for a moment. You may think that I'm going to say something completely irrelevant, but you'll see how I'm going to tie both things together. There's a wonderful passage in the Symposium of Plato where he talks about love as being a philosopher. Why? Because it says that love is yearning for something. And those who have it don't yearn for it because they have it. And those who think that they can't lose it don't yearn for it because they take it as a given. The same happens with wisdom. Fools don't pursue wisdom because they think they already have it. The gods don't pursue wisdom because they already have it and can't lose it. The same applies. This is a spirit. The spirit of philosophy is the spirit of awareness of one's own limits, as opposed to the spirit of, you'd say, blasphemy and transgression. And when it comes to the classical liberal tradition, this is a very fundamental intellectual underpinning, because you see it manifesting in terms of a constant call for limitations, including the limitations upon oneself. So when it comes to the relationship between law and morality, there is a sort of understanding there that you cannot equate both. If you equate both, you're going to have a state who is going to be, in a sense, the moral leader and the moral referee. And if they make all-encompassing legislation and positive law matches natural law, which, by the way, I'm a very big fan of that tradition, I think you are as well. If you combine them, you have zero areas where people are free from, in a sense, from interference. You have an all-encompassing state, and the philosophical foundations of an all-encompassing state that recognizes and respects no freedom. And also you have the spirit of the commissar, of the Robespierre, who wanted to have the Age of Reason cult around himself. Or you have the omni state official who wants to say, I'm going to have massive freedom, unlimited freedom for myself, and endless tyranny and subjugation for everyone else. It's really ironic that lots of advocates of this very persuasion are blaming classical liberals for allegedly having no principles of limitations, where in fact all they want absolute freedom for themselves and absolute tyranny for everyone else. So when it comes to this, it's absolutely true. And it is, in a way, tragic. It's a difficult ordeal. But I think there is tremendous sincerity in telling people that there are no easy solutions. If we go down that path, we go to totalitarianism, because we're going to have a state that presides over a culture, let's say, that recognizes no limits to the state, because it identifies law and morality and combines both. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, there is absolutely such a thing as people not being moral enough to sustain a culture that respects the institutions that make liberty possible. And where we have moral corruption that way, we're talking about internal threats to that culture that are sometimes as dangerous as external threats to it. And yes, saying that there should be no state coercion of particular moral views and of people when it comes to imposing upon them a particular moral framework doesn't mean that civil society isn't going to function organically. It means let people function organically, let them just meet each other, talk to each other, and they are going to engage in all sorts of things that may be a bit bad. For instance, let me just tell you, it's not that it happens because of classical liberalism. It happens because of human nature. If we are 100 people in a room, we meet in a room, and we start talking to each other, and 2 or 3 of them start saying things that 97 of us consider to be absolutely psychopathic, we are going to marginalize them.
Of course.
Now, if we do this, we are going to call for their marginalization. And here is the great difference between online spaces and offline spaces. You can have absolute psychopaths in online spaces who can get away with behavior that wouldn't be acceptable in a traditional social setting, because they have their audience that is reinforcing their negative behaviors. So it's absolutely the case that people exert moral pressure on each other. We don't need the state to do this. And we don't need classical liberalism to do this. We do this because we are social beings. So I think that there is a tendency of blaming lots of things on classical liberalism in classical liberal societies, which I want to resist a bit, because I think this is one of the major areas of subversion that post-liberals are trying to impose on us.
Well, I completely agree with you, because a theme I've seen in post-liberal thought is the same theme I've seen in progressive thought, ironically, though the post-liberals on the right hate the progressives, though they in many ways adopt the same style of argumentation. And the style is that they'll say something like, I think I actually got into an argument on X with your colleague Sargon at one point about this very topic, where his point, as I recall it, was a system is what it does. So classical liberalism can be blamed for the things that classical liberalism has produced. But what this, I think, elides is that the tool of progressivism, politically, is to break the system and then call for more progressive government to fix the thing that they just broke. And you see this endlessly play out. It's just the time scale is so long that attention-starved people often can't see it happening in real time, and it takes a while for them to notice this trend. For an example is, in the United States, we endlessly talk about how bad our healthcare system is compared to Europe, because we have employee-sponsored healthcare systems. And we talk about, oh my God, the government must get involved and do something about this. But of course, if you look at the history, these plans didn't arise because capitalists and free market thinkers were twirling their mustaches trying to ruin people's lives. In FDR's era, in World War II, he imposed wage caps as an anti-inflation mechanism in interfering in the market. And then, in order to compete for better employees, companies started offering health insurance at the company level as a way to attract the employees. Then the IRS said it was tax-free, and that became a industry. So the progressive market intervention created the healthcare problem that now the progressives say is the fault of the classic liberals and the capitalists, and that they must have more government power to fix. And this is, I think, the troubling pattern I see, where the classic liberal is blamed for the things that the classic liberal opposed. But in fact, it was over our dead body that these things happened historically. But I struggle to find ways to draw people's attention to this, that in reality, what people are ascribing to my worldview are the perversions of my worldview and the fights that people who had my ideas historically lost. It wasn't our doing. So I don't know if you've had the same experience, and if you have, how do you combat this style of argumentation, which I think has a lot of force and people find very gripping?
Well, I don't know how effective it is, but I think there are a few people who are listening and are convinced by the very simple observation that you cannot equate every government's actions in a culture that you just call liberal, or a country that you just call liberal, with liberal philosophy. Why? Because it's absolutely possible for there to be a classical liberal criticism of a particular politician, even if that politician claims to be a classical liberal, and even if they are. It's absolutely possible to have a classical liberal criticism of a classical liberal politician. The same applies for politicians throughout the West. So it seems to me, to a very large extent, that something is happening here. People are equating their society with classical liberalism, and they tend to think that there can be no such thing as a classical liberal criticism of modern society, which there absolutely can be. And they are essentially saying, I don't have to read about the tradition, because the tradition is what has led here, what has led to today. And they frequently end up focusing on different literature. And one of my questions is, well, if you're going to spend, let's say, I'm going to just say a number, 100 hours reading, why are you going to spend 100 hours reading Marxist analysis of modernity in order to give the benefit of the doubt to Marxists, as opposed to actually reading the classical liberal tradition? And also, we come from an educator's background. I think that's something that we share in common, and that's a really important thing, among other things. But that's an important thing. We sort of know the kind of the various number of mistakes that lots of students are making when they start reading a particular kind of literature. For instance, every subject in philosophy doesn't end up in a universal consensus. It ends up with more debate. And what you have across disciplines is lots of different perspectives that become increasingly more sophisticated. So the very notion of entering a field, reading a book that is very sophisticated, and thinking that the mysteries of the world have been completely revealed to you, is something that lots of people experience in their lives. The issue is, once you are an educator and you experience it many times, at some point you say, well, let's be a bit more humble. Let's be intellectual. Let's show some intellectual humility here, and just try to to resist all those biases that come with entering a field, especially when it comes with insufficient critical thinking. So I think that this is what is happening in the Western world, throughout the Western world. There are people who have been absolutely brainwashed with the idea that the current thing is a natural outgrowth of classical liberalism, which is a fallacy. Because if you try to make all these claims, you could say, well, right, okay, if you think that classical liberalism is an outcome of Protestantism, and then Protestantism is an outcome of nominalism, and then nominalism is an outcome of whatever, you go back, it's like saying, right, okay, everyone is guilty. Why? Because there is change. I think that this is it's very speculative, and reality is much more complex than that. So one of the major things to point out is that there is a deviation between the theory or the various theories, because we're talking about a very rich tradition. It isn't a person-bound like Marxism, which later became less person-bound, but it is much more a philosophy that is multifaceted. It's like the delta of the River Nile. It isn't just one line of water. It's many different strands. And so the number one thing I'd say is to say that just because a particular government has taken particular measures or has pursued a policy for decades that has disastrous consequences, doesn't mean that this policy can't be criticized from a classical liberal perspective.
Yes, and you said something I thought I wanted to pick up. You said many things, but one thing in particular you said that I want to pick up the strand on is because it's a tension in classic liberalism and sometimes difficult to articulate. There's a certain amount of humility inherent in classic liberalism, but there is also a certain amount of certainty in that, underpinning classical liberalism must be the foundational belief that humans have a nature and that human nature is by and large unchanging. It is what it is. And that, as a result, like if you look at the American Declaration of Independence, what should a just government do? It should preserve the right to life of its people. It should preserve their right to liberty. It should preserve their right to pursue their happiness, including their property rights. And it should not impose on them and infringe these rights except to the extent necessary. It should try to minimize these infringements. But that presupposes that humans are a type of being that appreciates freedom, but doesn't want its freedom to be so extensive that it's just being killed by pirates and people wandering in and raiding the coastline. They want some security and they want the ability to pursue their ends, but they don't want other people to be able to pursue their ends to the extent that they can just rob your house and leave you with nothing. So that these are constant, and that these features of human nature are reflected in classical liberal theory, such that when we aim for them, we try to create philosophies and governments that will maximize these natural rights. But we are humble in the fact that we don't think we know all the answers, and that we do want to have limitations on ourselves, and we don't trust ourselves to have unlimited power in this regard. So maybe you could speak on that, because it's a interesting tension between, on one hand, deep humility about my own limitations and failures, and on the other hand, pretty much absolute certainty about human nature on the other hand. And I think once that is articulated, it's easier to meaningfully make a comparison between true classical liberalism and its more progressive mutations over time.
Yes. No, first of all, I completely agree with you. And this kind of certainty manifests not in the positive sense, i.e., we are going to have a government that is going to force you to do what we think is the right thing. We are going to have a society, we're going to call for a society that wants a state that doesn't become an obstacle to these rights. So in a way, this certainty isn't the type of certainty that is going to manifest in a positive pursuit and imposition of something to people. It's a certainty that manifests in allowing room for people to make their own choices. So there absolutely is that tension, which I think is a tension everywhere. But I wouldn't say necessarily it's a bad thing. It's actually being honest with the complexity of life. So for people who want canned answers, maybe that's insufficient. But I think that for people who actively have the humility we mentioned before, and know that they don't know everything, but they understand that they must act, and in order to act, one must have some idea of who one is, who human beings are. They have to, in a way, they have to accept that this is how life is. So I don't see I see this as a form of certainty that isn't manifesting in a restrictive sense to people. It restricts only what we consider to be the state's right to impose on us, things on us. But one thing to say is that there absolutely is more to expand on this. And I want to mention the example of Aristotle. Aristotle is one of the greatest philosophers of all time, and all people want to claim him for their own school. You have Ayn Rand, you have post-liberals who are trying to claim Aristotle for their own sense. But post-liberals will very frequently stress the idea of natural inequality that he mentions, which isn't part of classical liberalism. It's the opposite that is part of classical liberalism. But they will very conveniently omit what he says about the importance of choice for morality. Because he says, yeah, you can be trained into have good habits, but in order for you to be a virtuous person, you have to choose to act well. There is an element of choice there that is required for virtue. So when we are talking about political philosophy and we want to have a just society, and we ask ourselves, right, how does a society respect us? How does a society respect what in the classical liberal tradition is considered to be the dignity of the individual, prima facie? How does it respect that? How does it respect a moral agent? Well, it has to respect choice, because you can't coerce virtue. If you live in a society where you are coercing virtue, first of all, you are disrespecting moral agents, and second, you are habituating people into being members of a nanny state. You're habituating people into not making choices. And if we are to bring our Aristotle here to our dear post-liberals, we need to remind them of the question of habituation. When they invoke Aristotle, we need to remember, and here he's correct, when we're legislating and when we live in society, we are being affected by our environment, social and natural. So when our environment is habituating us into living in a society where we are coerced to act according to the dictates and the whims of, the board of directors of the Communist Party or of the fascist Nazi or whatever party, or of an absolute feudal monarch, we're actually being disrespected as moral agents. Our agency isn't being respected, and also we are being habituated into not being moral agents. We're habituating into being corrupt individuals. So there absolutely is the tension you mentioned, but this is what comes along with the realization that reality is much more complex. And let me just give you another example. One of the other tensions that manifests, and here is where lots of very ideological classical liberals are led astray, is that yes, we need to have a focus on individual rights, but there also needs to be such a thing as focus as the common good or public security, if you'd like. I understand that many dislike this, and they think that, well, if you mention the notion of the common good, therefore you must be a post-liberal. I don't think that's that's the case, but I do appreciate the fact that there are many dangers in appealing to the notion of the common good. That's why I will say, just very briefly, I think that when it comes to meta-ethics and ethical outlook, I think intuitionism is a very sophisticated view, which understands both the necessity for focusing on rights, also as well as the notion of the common good. And I think, for instance, someone like Aquinas, St. Thomas Aquinas, did have such an emphasis.
Well, and this is an interesting area that you've brought us to, because I think there's you mentioned earlier that there's diverging schools of classic liberalism, which I agree with. And one of the big divides is what I would call the American strand versus the continental strand. And in part, at least where I levy criticism against my European brothers, is because around the time of the American founding, David Hume introduced radical skepticism into continental philosophy. And all of a sudden, it was very difficult to ground a meta-ethic in anything, to ground a metaphysic in anything. This is, he famously introduced the idea that can you prove induction, these sorts of things, that, reason is always slave to the passions. And on that chasis, continental philosophy developed. And then, as a reaction to Hume, you had Thomas Reid and the Scottish school of common sense realism, common sense moral realism, sometimes it's called, which was very, very popular in America because it was brought over here and it was taught at what became Princeton. It was very influential amongst the founding fathers, and is actually reflected in the Declaration of Independence, where they say that it is self-evident that we are invested by our creator with natural rights. It's not something that needs to be proven. It's axiomatically available to humans that the moral law exists, that natural rights exist, that this is just a feature of humanity. That, for example, you mentioned free will earlier, that we have some modicum of free will, that we exist in a real world, that we can trust our senses. These sorts of things that philosophically are very difficult to prove. Thomas Reid's philosophy says it is foolish to even challenge. You just accept them as a matter of common sense. And that led to American classic liberalism being wrapped in a religious metaphysic. So, we would say, yes, we have natural rights, of course, because we were endowed by our creator with those natural rights. So in terms of the certainty, it becomes a religious certainty. Whereas when I've spoken to someone like Helen Pluckrose, who I quite admire, she's very European in her classic liberalism, where she has many of the same ideas, but rejects the metaphysic, which is it has some interesting differences. But one of the concerns that I have is, how do we armor the belief system against intruding ideologies, right? When someone comes in and they say to you, well, I want more liberty. I want the liberty to travel. I want the liberty to have more healthcare. I want the liberty not to go into debt when I get sick. I want the liberty to be able to engage in my hobbies and to get days off, which are not classic liberties. These are, in fact, privileges that a increasingly powerful state would have to grant you. How do you ward off these attacks, especially in the European sensibility, without reference to a metaphysic? And this is, I think, a difficulty that I've detected in Europe, and increasingly a difficulty in the States as people become less religious. Because my experience has been, if I try to explain natural rights, natural law, classic liberalism to somebody who has a religious upbringing, they intuitively grasp it. I'll say, yes, of course there's a human nature. Yes, of course there are certain aspects of humanity that reflect the fact that we were made in God's image, and we should build societies that honor those things. Yes, of course. But if I speak to someone who was raised in an atheist worldview, I have to build a framework for that. They don't have a set of assumptions that lead to that. And I don't know if you can speak to that, but how do you envision this issue, and how do you envision armoring the classic liberal belief system against these intruders?
Right. So That's an excellent question, and you are essentially raising several of my most favorite topics of conversation. So you mentioned several things, so I would have to expand a bit. I'll try to keep it brief.
Of course.
Right. Okay. So let's go to Hume. I wouldn't place Hume as a continent in a way as someone who is in the continental camp. I'd place him as essentially the pioneer, along with Adam Smith, of Scottish Enlightenment, and I do count Thomas Reid as a member of that school as well. And I do think that the Scottish Enlightenment was very much influential in both sides of the Atlantic. That said, I would have to say that I don't think that it's the philosophy so much that it was the issue, in order to explain the difference between how the two versions of liberalism have historically arose. I think it's history much more than mere ideas. And let me give you a very brief example why. The French Enlightenment had also the French physiocrats, who were classical liberals, and they were complete laissez-faire classical liberals. You could say that in some respects they're even more closer to the American liberalism that you mentioned than they are to the continental liberalism, and in some respects even more violently than current classical liberals. So I wouldn't put Hume there, and there's a reason why. Hume is somewhat the rejection there, the disagreement is epistemological. Is much more about how can we know things, and it has to do with whether we can answer the skeptic, or whether we think that we don't have to answer the skeptic. But I would say that I would place very much Hume into the tradition of Scottish Enlightenment, who would be much more prone to say, even if he would completely dismiss, philosophically speaking, the idea of divine providence, or the metaphysical baggage of, for instance, the Thomists, he would definitely be pro let the market decide. He's a proto-Hayekian in a way. Right. Let's move a bit forward. I think the main reasons why classical American liberalism differs from the European liberalism are entirely historical, almost entirely historical. First of all, if we check at the French Revolution and the American Revolution, there are some major historical differences. The American Revolution was much more clear with respect to what the goal was, whereas the French Revolution was primarily anti-feudal absolutism, anti-ancien regime. And one of the tragedies of the French Revolution was that they did the revolution against the old regime, and then they didn't know exactly what to do. They did have the Declaration of the Rights of Man. I think that was in 1789 or 1792, maybe 1789. But there were so many people, and there was such a thing as rule by assembly there, and it was complete chaos. They didn't know what to do. And add to this the fact that they were instantly attacked by a number of European monarchies, and that led to prolonged warfare. Warfare makes people paranoid. Prolonged warfare makes people paranoid constantly. So they started looking at enemies everywhere, because they thought that they had the idea of an existential threat on a momentary basis. So they started looking at enemies everywhere. That's why they started then during the French Terror, and then they had Napoleon. It was constant warfare. And then there was a peace ever since, from the fall of Napoleon to the middle of the 19th century. But then there was again intense warfare. And when you are in a situation where you have such a landscape, it's much easier to rally and to accept centralization. And one thing, it's that after World War II, the welfare state came in Europe to stay, because Europe was practically leveled down by World War II. And this is a kind of precariousness that is going to make someone think that, well, okay, ideology is one thing. I really need to find somewhere to sleep at night. And I really don't know where I'm going to eat today. So that was why the welfare state and the ideology of welfarism came in Europe and is much more entrenched in it. Now, there's always the philosophical accompaniments of it that seek to justify particular policies that are adopted in particular places, whereas they're not adopted in elsewhere. And I would say that, philosophically speaking, the topic of modern liberalism or of social liberalism or liberal perfectionism in academia has a major contradiction in it. They think that autonomy, the central ideal of autonomy that is part of human freedom, can be outsourced to a collective. And that manifests both in the Rousseauian sense, in that you are free when you participate in a political body that has absolute power and no checks and balances. That's essentially, in a nutshell, the Rousseauian definition of autonomy. Then you have the welfare state, Gibbs' definition of autonomy, where they're sort of saying, well, you need to have equal opportunities. In order for you to be free, you have to be raised to a particular level, and you have to level other people down. And then equality of opportunity turn into equity. Why? Because then you have people who are saying, right, even if equality of opportunity and equality of outcome are distinct, they are smuggling it through the back door, and they're saying equality of outcome is going to be our criterion of equality of opportunity. That's why we have wokeness that says wherever there is disparity of outcome, we are going to constantly say, and we are going to infer that there was a inequality of opportunity, and we are going to call for equity. That's how it disintegrates into wokeness. So the last question: how do we try to appeal to people who are atheists and who don't feel the force of moral considerations for their own sake, and they'd be more likely to listen to fear and to more materialistic concerns? Well, I think the answer is, again, to focus on historical conditions and focus on the absolute tragedy of every attempt to impose in modern society, but not only in modern society, a totalistic version of the good life. And especially when this happened after the Protestant Reformation, it led to the prolonged warfare between Catholics and Protestants and endless bloodshed. So when it comes to civil society and trying to talk to people who won't respond instantly to the moral force of the considerations you mentioned of the natural rights tradition, which is, I'd say, also the tradition I embrace of classical liberalism, I'd say tell them about that. Tell them about the consequences of living in a society where they think that the state should have absolute authority and no checks and balances.
Well, so the challenge becomes, and I'm speaking from the American experience now because I don't quite have enough data to say this is happening the same way in Europe, though I suspect it has been similar. The challenge becomes that the progressive types, the postmodernist types, the post-structuralist types, the cultural Marxist types, don't fight an honorable fight. What happened in America is that at around the turn of the century, 1900 into the 1920s, with Woodrow Wilson's presidency in particular, you had the rise of John Dewey and progressive education. And this changed the idea that education was no longer about giving people mastery of the academic core disciplines, mathematics, reading, writing, some science, and then the Western tradition, history, philosophy, and then letting them free to pursue their life on this foundation. It became a tool to shape the citizens of tomorrow to be productive. Now, and once you change the purpose of education, the telos of education in this way, what you start seeing is, of course, well, if we're trying to shape them in this way, then we should shape them ideologically. We should teach them different things. And natural rights gave way to human rights, which, of course, is it's almost an incoherent concept, because a natural right is a moral commandment. A legal right is a creation of the legal system. A human right is neither. It's a policy preference, which is then discussed as if it were either a moral commandment or a legal commandment, when it is by definition neither. Otherwise, if it was a legal commandment, they would just say the law commands that you do X, Y, and Z. And the classic liberal tradition, which emphasized natural rights, which are always negative rights, always restriction on the government, never impositions on the people, that a nanny state would increasingly tax you, increasingly intrude in your life to create the type of citizen it wants, became the norm. And I looked back on Calvin Coolidge, who was one of the American president who I think was the true last bastion of classic liberalism in the way he thought about these things. And he wrote about our Declaration of Independence, and I love this quote, so I'll just share it. If all men are created equal, that is final. If they are endowed with inalienable rights, that is final. If governments derive their just power from the consent of the governed, that is final. No advance, no progress can be made beyond these propositions. If anyone wishes to deny their truth and their soundness, the only direction in which he can proceed historically is not forward, but backward, towards the time when there was no equality, no rights of the individual, no rule of the people. Those who wish to proceed in that direction cannot lay claim to progress. They are reactionary. And what I've seen is that the education system has become a vector to transform the reactionary into the progressive through the miracle of postmodern language, where words are transformed. And racism is no longer a person's personal belief in the inferiority of one race or decision to treat someone worse on the basis of their race, but is now systemic racism, which is a collection of factors in which maybe no one is racist, but the system creates disparate outcomes. And equality of outcome is, as you said, it displaces equality of opportunity and is then rebranded as equity. So the challenge, I guess, that I'm trying to tee up here is how do we pick this fight meaningfully when the foundational beliefs are being shaped by educators, and as a former educator, I can tell you, who overwhelmingly subscribe to non-classic liberal ideologies and overwhelmingly teach non-classical liberal ideologies to our children.
Right. First of all, I completely agree with you, and I think that John Dewey especially had a very negative effect in destroying the classical spirit. Now, I know some of his fans may find this comment completely outrageous, but I think that with Dewey especially, we have a call for essentially student activists. He doesn't want people to educate students who can think critically. He wants to tell them what to think and become, activists for the cause that he is going to give to them, instead of giving them the opportunity to think for themselves and potentially come to conclusions that are contrary to the ones he would want them to come to. And I think that this Deweyan spirit is very much the spirit of the American progressive education system, because it sort of inverts the finality of what it is that should be, an endpoint, the final. And so, right, let's stop talking about the Declaration of Independence and the natural rights that Jefferson mentioned there as being final, we are going to talk about our own will and whims as them being final, and we're going to essentially brainwash students into thinking that the only moral life is for them to be instruments of our own will. Right, so how do we fight back against this? I think that this is something that we need to be very honest about. Classical liberals do have a strong individualistic strand in them. We have a strong individualistic tendency. And the problem with that is that there is low membership in lone wolf society. So we need to come together in a way and form societies where we meet each other and understand how we are going to exert a positive influence in society. Now, I don't have any golden solution to this, but I think that every person who tries to brainwash people has a sort of first mover advantage in a setting that is, in a way, normal. So as an educator, I always wanted to make my students think critically. I don't mind if I have a life. I'm not going to mind if some of my students think differently. Then it's okay. It's human. But the point is that this balance, let's say we have the order that is going to be disrupted. It's going to be disrupted first by the subverters, the ones who are going to try and brainwash students. So I'd say, let's be a bit realistic without panicking. Any person who is in education, I'd say, I don't know what your experience was, but I would say that there is a natural tendency for students to resist what it is that they are being told in school and in university. Some are playing along with it, but others do have the opposite tendency. It's like I think there's especially a deviation. So the fact that I'd say that leftists right now are overrepresented in academia doesn't necessarily mean that all the young generation is lost. There are people who will always be against their education system because it is education system and because young people have a sort of rebelliousness in them. But what I would say is that we should, in a sense, form societies and helping each other and start getting the message across and start communicating a message in a way that is much more holistic. Why? Because what I constantly see, every person who is trying to be anti-Western, and most of them are intentionally so, in, let's say, influencers, people who are anti-liberal, they do this on purpose, and they very frequently put forward a very fragmentary misrepresentation of what it is that they're doing. So there is no alternative to doing the hard work. So I would say we need to constantly have a historical understanding of our tradition and understanding of the criticism, but also understanding of the various dangers, both internal and external. So again, there are no easy solutions. I want to be very clear. I don't want to come across as someone who says that they have all the answers, because I don't. I want to be, in a sense, someone who accompanies people along their journey towards wisdom. I put it a bit dramatically there, I understand.
Yes, and this is why it's such a difficult topic, because first of all, at least in America, and I think in Europe, the education system is overwhelmingly progressive. So, to the extent that there's a critique that's made about the education system on this basis, it almost couldn't be too extreme. I know that I was struck by this when I became a teacher, because I studied undergrad at NYU, which is where Thomas Nagel teaches, and this is one of the best philosophy departments in the country. And it was very rigorous and very structured and academic. And then I had an education minor, and it was, if you could repeat verbatim the talking points, the slogan of the day, you got an A. It was an ideological instruction more than anything else, and and that's housed within the same university. And this struck with me, and I thought about this a lot later because there is a move that we have seen towards changing the purpose of education. And I think it does trace back to Dewey, but now it's just a modern phenomenon that needs to be confronted, where the pursuit, even at like the university level, a university like Yale, they changed their mission statement. So their mission statement is no longer framed in terms of pursuing truth, but in terms of pursuing a more just society. And these are very different things. You want your universities to be pursuing truth, not imposing politics. And then the universities become very confused when they are treated like political bodies, because of course they have become political bodies. And then the universities like the University of Chicago that stay more true to the classical roots are not treated in the same way because they do not act as political bodies. And I think that one thing that we maybe could do as classic liberals is start building informational centers to articulate this in an easy way for people. So when people come to me and they say like, oh, like Ryan, you're looking at my resume, are you going to hire me? And I'm like, well, you went to woke university. You went to a school that, I'm looking at my database, is like primarily teaching activism. This is a warning sign for me. I'm going to have to think about this when I interview you. Whereas if you went to a school that better aligned with what I understand the purpose of education to be, this would be a green light for me, and I'd feel more comfortable. And I think that we have to be willing to fight. This is just one example of an idea that came to me, but we have to be willing to fight these non-government-led battles for the culture, where we say we are going to put the flag down and say we have moral beliefs that are not limited to limited government. We have actual moral and cultural beliefs about what the West is, about what civil society is, and we are going to fight for them. And we are going to fight for them informationally, culturally. We're going to fight for them on every front. In fact, this fight is so important, I don't trust the government to do it. It is something that I must do. And I don't think we have organized that effort enough, which is why I think conversations like this are so important, because we have to start broadcasting this effort.
Yes. So first of all, I agree with you on this. And I think that it has many layers. One of it is extreme comfort, because to a degree, we live in a world that provides us with comforts that are historically unprecedented. And ever since the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was such an illusion that arose that that's the end of history. And all you need to do now is be a consumer and an entrepreneur and make money and just consume. That's not true. And I think that during the Cold War, especially towards the end, there was a overemphasis on the economic aspect of liberalism, which is very, very respectable, and I think we should definitely uphold. But there was insufficient focus on the political and the social aspect of it. That's why, for instance, we are talking about the role of civil society in classical liberalism, and people are looking at us thinking that we are just completely insane, especially in some online spheres. So it's absolutely the case that freedom comes along with responsibility. It's absolutely the case that culture is incredibly important in safeguarding liberty. This is where I would say we have to criticize many ideological liberals, you could say libertarians, who think that they can just isolate themselves in their farm, in their estate, in their country, and somehow everyone's going to leave them alone. This isn't going to happen. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but this is absolutely not going to happen. Just read history. There is zero example of this happening. No one is going to leave you alone. So people need to understand that when it comes to safeguarding liberty is not a given. They have to be responsible. They cannot be forced to be responsible, but they have to be persuaded, especially the young ones, that they have a lot to lose. And in a way, we do have a disadvantage when it comes to arguing for classical liberalism, because in some respects, it is counterintuitive. Because people, especially when they follow politics and the news cycle that is designed to make people enraged, and there's also popular responsibility for it, the responsibility of people for it, they are in a perpetual state of anger, and anger makes you think less rationally. And when you're angry, it's incredibly easy to think that there should be zero limits to anything you want to do, because your anger justifies you doing it. Mm-hmm. So there is always going to be a disadvantage that we are going to have in spaces where rage reigns, where rage is reigning. So we do have a disadvantage here, but it doesn't mean that we're going to lose. Why? Because, first of all, academia has almost always been a bit more leftist. Because for reasons that Thomas Sowell has really well explained, is that academics are dealing with ideas. They don't have material results. They don't have tangible results of their actions. So their trial and error process makes it very easy for them to not assume responsibility. So academia has always been a bit unrealistic. The fact that the left is overrepresented there isn't necessarily signaling the end of the fight. It's definitely something that needs to be addressed, but it doesn't mean that it's the end of the fight. So when it comes to the other bit, I think that there is such a disadvantage which we have to accept, and we have to, in a sense, power up, understand, and do our homework, and then come back and do good work in supporting this. And was it John Quincy Adams who said, "A republic if you can keep it"? Yes. Wasn't a republic irrespective of the moral fiber of the nation, or which is manifesting in culture. So that's the thing, is that it seems to me that we need to have tough conversations about things like multiculturalism, and especially particular multiculturalist experiments and the very adverse consequences that they're having, but also the kind of numbness that lots of ideological classical liberals have when it comes to these points, because they sadly they don't want to do the realistic work. They may be too comfortable, and they may thinking, and their comfort may create the illusion to them that the state and other groups are going to leave them alone. They're not.
Well, and I think this is a challenge because, and I think you're right, there's always been a left lean to academia. And I think even Thomas Sowell's a great person to invoke, because his idea of the constrained vision versus the unconstrained vision, I think, is even more apropos than a left-right distinction. There's a strong strain of unconstrained thought in academia, the belief that humans are a blank slate, and that if we only had the right government and the right ideas in the hands of these select few, we could have the perfect society and the utopia would be ushered in, as opposed to the more classic liberal conception of intrinsic human nature, and that humans just have these limits, and that we are who we are. And as a result, you need to work with who people are and build societies that reflect that, and those reflect those limitations, rather than having this unconstrained vision. But the challenge is, at least in America, and I think in Europe too, traditionally, education might have been veering more towards this unconstrained vision, but religion was the part of society that encouraged people to think in a more constrained way about what humans are and what our nature is. So you had the tension between these forces, and I'm oversimplifying, but there is as education becomes more and more and more dominant in our societies, and more people have more degrees and multiple degrees, etc., and religion wanes, and you see less people religious in Europe, for example. Though in America, we actually have a religious boom on the horizon, and it seems like the next generation is going to be more religious than the previous one for the first time in quite a long time. That was a vector for transmitting this kind of germ, the germ of classic liberalism, the kind of philosophic idea that would sprout when given the correct conditions. And this is, again, something Calvin Coolidge harped on, not the need for more government, but the need for more character, more wisdom, more knowledge, more people in society who are talking about these ideas and permeating them. But Europe in particular is increasingly secular. I think, I haven't seen the stats recently, but it has become very, very secular, to my knowledge, at least. So what is the new vector? If religion is not going to be the thing going forward, how else can we permeate these ideas into society?
Well, I think that this is a very tough question, because first of all, I don't know the extent to which Europeans are becoming atheistic. Second, I don't know if the problem right now in Europe is secularism. I'd say it's the imminent collapse of secularism, because Europe has a problem with keeping, in a way, religion out of its politics. And what do I mean by that? I mean that Europe has right now a tremendous problem with let's say, a sort of the equivalent of European wokeness, which manifests in being very silent with respect to radical Islamism.
Yes.
So that's, in a way, a ticking bomb waiting to explode, and I wouldn't necessarily describe it as a secular one. I'd say that, in a way, the problem here is the waning of secular institutions. Because, for instance, there are conversations here in the UK Parliament about reintroducing blasphemy laws. There is a constant push of branding things as being, let's say, Islamophobic. And one of the things that I want to mention, especially if we look at the UN, there is a day about anti-Semitism, there is a day dedicated to Islamophobia, but there is not a day dedicated to Christianophobia.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's something that we need to ask ourselves why this is happening. So I would say that Europe right now is in a very tumultuous state. And it's very tough to generalize, because we are talking about, tens of countries, each of which has a very different trajectory than each other, but are experimenting in a very bad way with multiculturalism, because this is forced upon them by an unelected bureaucracy in Brussels. And this isn't helping anyone. It makes society much less safe for everyone included. There are no exceptions to people here. So I would say that the problem in Europe, I'd say, isn't so much secularism. It's the kind of multiculturalism that is combined with wokeness. Mm-hmm. Why? Because you could say multiculturalism is laissez-faire when it comes to cultures, which is problematic in itself. But once you combine wokeness with it and the intersectional narrative there, that's when you start ranking all these cultures in terms of oppressor and oppressed. And it is invariably the European straight white man who is seen as the enemy of the EU, of the high echelons of the EU, and all other groups are deemed to be oppressed. And some people call it critical migration theory. So I'd say that in this case, what is happening here is the waning of secularism and secular governance in Europe, and the fear of many Europeans in some societies, especially European leaders, to assert secular institutions. And because of these multiculturalist experiments in each country, you have ethnic ghettos and ethnic blocs that are arising, and they are pushing for greater political power for themselves and greater pressure. And in a way, they are doing this, and they don't show signs that they want to respect European culture. It's not that goodwill is met with gratitude. It's met with, hey guys, we think you're weak, so we're going to take more advantage of you. So these are problems that we have to address. And these are problems that fly under the radar of a classical liberal who is very ideology-minded. Someone who would say, for instance, I only look at individuals and I don't look at anything else, would miss this. And they would miss the culture, the very threats to the very culture that John Quincy Adams was saying, a republic if you can keep it. So all this is conditional.
So the reason I've been focusing a bit on the intersection between faith and classic liberalism is in part because one of the things I was looking forward to in this discussion was the variation between American liberalism and European liberalism in this way. And on my channel, one of the things I spent a lot of time talking about is this exact issue that you've raised, and you put it perfectly. So I have nothing to add to it. Which is you were focusing on multiculturalism. And just to say the obvious, multiculturalism is false. And as a result, all the fruits of it will be poisonous. And the reason, from like a American liberal tradition, that multiculturalism is false is that you go back to our declaration, at the Declaration of Independence. We said we were endowed by our Creator with natural rights, and the purpose of the government is to secure those rights. So cultures and governments can be judged and ranked on how well they secure natural rights and how little they infringe those rights. And if that is true, then multiculturalism is false, because I can look at, in Islamist society and see that they are massively infringing on natural rights in every way. In fact, the concept is alien to the way that they govern their people. So this is not equal to a Western society. It is false. And because of that, you then have a clear delineation where you can say, if we're going to have migration, we must have assimilation, because multiculturalism is just not true. But that conception goes back to the first thing we were talking about. The certainty about human nature, the certainty about natural rights, the certainty that this is, in fact, the way to build a just society. And from a religious framework, again, you can build off of core Christian traditions, for example, and say, God is good, you're made in the image of God. That gives you human nature by itself. There's a direct connection there. But absent that religious tradition, this is actually a more difficult concept to land. That there is a fixed human nature, that we are certain about this, that this is the correct metric, because they'll say to you, no, the correct metric is to the extent that you can remove oppression. Well, no, you fool! Don't you know that morals are subjective and everyone's entitled to their own opinion, and there is no such thing as truth, and there is no such thing as morality or goodness. So all cultures are equal, even if they have barbaric practices that disquiet me and hurt me even to watch them. I must accept these things because I have no basis to do otherwise. And this is, I think, one of the challenges I've been trying to figure out on my channel is, if I'm talking to somebody who does not have a religious background, and I'm not going to convince them to become religious or to believe in God in a conversation, nor would I even endeavor to, how do I go about convincing them that natural law is right, that humans have a nature? Because if I can convince them of that, then I think I can convince them of the classic liberal tradition. But if I can't convince them of that, if they've bought into this unconstrained vision, then I can't convince them multiculturalism is false. And I can't convince them of all the downstream problems that you just raised. And I think that's the part of the conversation that I've been focusing on for this reason, but it's a difficult one. So I don't know what your thoughts are. That's putting you on the spot. That's maybe a difficult question, but how do you go about that sort of conversation?
So I have good news and bad news. I'll start with the bad news and proceed to the good ones. The bad news, I think, is I don't think we can convince everyone. Sadly, I don't think we can convince everyone. The good news now is that I think we can convince many people. Right. So when it comes to ethics, because you are asking fundamentally an ethical question. When it comes to ethical philosophy, it's very difficult to find a ground for morality. This is one of the questions that have perennially troubled philosophers. And, some people have, there are some answers. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, but there is always the question there. And from what I've seen is that when people start thinking about things, ethically speaking, and they do, all of them have the tendency to use moral language, and even the most statedly morally nihilistic student will start using moral language when they think they're the victim of something. So I would say that try to find the gateway to what it is that makes them think, morally speaking. There will always be people in academia who are going to try and people trying to make fun of what you're saying if you're a moral realist in very controlled environments. But outside these controlled environments, people absolutely have a moral impulse, and there is nothing like victimization that shows it like victimization. So show them whether they think that they are victims of injustice. So they're telling you that truth doesn't exist. Well, yeah, why do they presuppose that there is such a thing as falsity, which they charge your objective statements with? They're going to talk about there not being morality and moral arguments being completely vacuous. And even you have lots of realpolitik people who are doing this, pulling this stunt. But especially if they are going to be in a situation where they think they're victims, they are going to resort to moral language. Have several examples in mind. Right. So it seems to me that we all have a moral impulse. Very few people don't have it. So when it comes to, if you ask people to be honest with themselves about what they consider to be an unjust arrangement, then they are going to be easier to persuade. So when you tell the people that, well, listen, if there is injustice, well, there's also justice. So because injustice is a deviation from justice. So I'd say try and focus on areas where they think that they're the victims of injustice. And especially this will work with social justice warriors, because social justice is the name that they're giving to sugarcoat their whims. That's a very key area to enter. That's a key bridge and gateway to enter into that conversation. Now, moral argumentation is notoriously difficult. But I'd say there are all sorts of people and there are all sorts of motives. Some people are motivated when it comes to by what they consider to be the right thing. They say, I want to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. Other people are saying, well, I want to do what my society tells me to because I want to lay low, I want to fly under the radar. And other people are who may be utterly convinced that morality is a fiction. They still want to be comfortable, so they will be motivated by their idea of comfort and the threats to their comfort. So I'd say the only way seems to be to try to understand who you are trying to persuade and confront them with the following, with the pertinent argument. And I will say, sadly, there are many people who are addicted to comfort. And if we see a cycle, there are surges of classical liberal governance after a prolonged period of economic mismanagement. So, for instance, Javier Milei now in Argentina has arisen in a context that is very specific. Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher arose in the same context. So, in some respects, we do. Anti-liberals have the first mover advantage, but it doesn't mean that we're going to lose everything. That's why I'd say it's incredibly important to focus on culture and on building avenues with which we can educate people about Western traditions, about religion. And if academia is going to be ultra-leftist, what we have to do is, for instance, we have to use our reach in order to educate people about cultural issues and about our history. And we will need to do lots of homework, but that has always been the case. It doesn't mean, but the thing is that we can afford to lose the occasional economic battle and pay a bit more taxes than we would like, but I don't think we can afford to lose the cultural battle.
I agree, because I think that the culture, people say it's just the culture war, or it's just in America. Now the phrase has moved on to DEI, so it's just a DEI issue. But this is not the issue. The issue for me is that if America is almost uniquely in the world a propositional nation where we were founded on an idea more than an ethnicity, though, of course, there was a particular people at a particular time, and I wouldn't deny that history. But the idea persists only so long as people believe it. So when you have a tax on the idea itself, where people, when someone wants to fundamentally change what America is, the first thing that they'll do is that they'll erode the concept of natural law and natural rights, and it'll turn into human rights and positive rights and this sort of thing, because that by eroding the foundation, you're then able to change everything that comes afterwards. And I think one of the challenges that I've had in current American politics is that, with President Trump, we have somebody who is very illiberal in many of his attitudes and tendencies and the way he wields governmental power. And, I often criticize him for exactly these things, but has also been uniquely successful in rolling back many of the cultural losses that occurred over the last 10, 15 years. And this puts me in an awful bind from time to time, because I find that on one hand, I want to criticize him for the excesses that I think of governmental overreach. And on the other hand, I want to protect him from the people who are going to want to weaponize him so that they can then usher in their own progressive cultural changes, which are the very thing that I was hoping to roll back. And I don't quite know how to resolve this tension, where it seems like in order to win the cultural victory, you often need allies who are themselves, I would say, not particularly classically liberal.
Right. So I'll start with Trump and then move back to the propositional nation discussion, which is a very interesting philosophical one. And I think that there are several category mistakes there. Right. Let's take Trump. I think that you can absolutely make a case for a defense of Trump in the current context from a realist perspective. Realism isn't incompatible with classical liberalism. You could say that almost every philosophy has a degree of abstraction, and it has to be applied in the real world. I use the example, and I think that this is something that we have to understand if we are genuine about wanting to win the cultural battle, or at least wanting to not lose it and be a fighting force if the battle is ongoing, which seems to me to be the most accurate way to present a free society. So it seems to me that the most important thing is to not lose the culture war. So we have to understand the pitfalls of ideology and the difference between ideology and realism. I'm not against abstraction, but abstraction is like being unable to read a map. Let's say I have a compass, and it's the equivalent of my political compass, and I want to go north. If I'm an ideologue, any course that isn't a straight line is going to be a deviation from the ideal, and is going to be a evil in a way. Because ideologues do tend to see things in a Manichaean way, as a dilemma between the moral and the corrupt, or absolute goodness and absolute evil. If we bear the actual landscape in mind, there's no such thing as a straight line. And occasionally, you maybe try to you may want to go north, and if you constantly try to move in a straight line, you will very soon meet a dead end. So you have to go in reverse or another direction, and then find the best way to move north. It seems to me that when we're talking about actual governance, it's like driving. Occasionally, we have to change course. It's not just a straight line. I understand that this may sound a bit cynical. I don't think it is. I think it's realistic. It's sincere about the kind of world we're living in. Now, when it comes to Trump, I agree with you. I have been, in some respects, critical of him, in other respects, supportive of him. I like to think of it as occupying a middle ground between the two forms of TDS, Trump derangement syndrome and Trump deification syndrome. I think we can definitely do this. There are lots of things to criticize about him, and in some respects, he is a liberal. But the question is whether at the end of the day, which in a way remains to be answered, whether at the end of the day, the executive power he wields will be used for ultimately illiberal purposes or not. It seems to me that despite his occasional illiberal ways of proceeding, the end goal is far less illiberal than lots of people expected. And we can see this now, especially today, last night, where lots of the people who are trying to advocate for a very illiberal solution to society's problems are starting turning their back against him. So, for instance, it's like he mentioned Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, and other such influencers who, in my mind, do have a sort of third worldist mindset. They tend to speak of the first world and the developed world as if it's the third world, and as if the culture, that's also a form of cultural blindness, as if the culture of the Western nations is like the culture of third world nations. It seems to me that they become progressively more dissatisfied with him, which I take it as a good sign. Because, for instance, I was thinking of lots of the online trad Catholics, which I don't think they're actual Catholics, by the way. I don't mean this as a criticism for Catholics. I mean this as a criticism for people who take religion, who use religion as a means for self-promotion. Yeah, when they're calling for a return to the 1400s, yeah, sorry, I'm happy that they're not getting what they want. And I'm happy that Trump isn't handing to them what they want. So, yes, I'm very skeptical about it. At the end of the day, I think we will have to see where he will, the goal he's aiming towards when it comes to using his power. One thing to notice here, because I want to raise a discussion here, which I think is interesting. And here is what is called, what frequently we can describe the dark side of politics. There is frequently this notion of the temporary suspension of the constitutional order and giving immense power to an individual in order to solve a crisis. This has been, people don't know about this, but this has been part of classical liberalism. Read chapter 18 of the second treatise of government of John Locke. This is the tradition of Cincinnatus as opposed to Caesar. I don't want a dictatorship. That's not what I'm calling for. But I'm saying that there are issues where a situation of emergency has to be declared, and that's why there is a focus on the idea of the leader of the executive branch being able to declare a situation of emergency. But this doesn't mean that classical liberalism is dead, as many of the Schmittians are implying. This means that we need to reinforce all our attempts to maintain a classical liberal culture, which is going to demand power be given back from any president who may declare a situation of emergency, and will send the message across to any such president that we don't want you to carry on with this. We will rise up. We will revolt. That's the difference between Cincinnatus and Julius Caesar. So I'm saying that this is.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Sorry.
Please,
finish your thought.
Yeah.
This is, I think. Sorry. Now we've just thought. I'll just say it because I interrupted you twice, and now I'm very rude. I apologize. This is, I think, a key difference between America as a federal system and what the EU has done in Europe, because one of the criticisms, and I think this is a criticism from a classical liberal perspective of the European Union, not the states that created it, is that structurally it does not have an executive who is responsive politically to the people rather than to the bureaucratic power centers within Europe. And as a result, when there is a crisis, there is no mechanism for the people to put someone into power who is going to take dramatic steps in order to combat the entrenched interests within the bureaucracy itself. And this, to me, is actually a form of crisis. When you have an unaccountable political bureaucracy that does not represent the will of the people, this is one of the easiest ways to reach tyranny in fast order. And this is the sort of thing that I love about President Trump, that he is taking a sledgehammer to our bureaucracies and that he's pushing back against all these things. My concern is that with him comes, like, for example, Justice Amy Coney Barrett. She's a wonderful justice. She writes beautifully. Her logic is very good. I agree with her a lot. I disagree with her sometimes. This is fine. She's supposed to express her legal views, right? But when she rules against him, there's a segment on the right that says, "Oh my God, how could she do this?" Right? We want our own puppets on the court. We don't want her to be exercising independent legal judgment. We want someone who will just vote with Trump all the time because he appointed her, and she should be loyal to him. And this strain of thought is, for all the things I appreciate about him, very, very dangerous. So I'm trying to find a way to thread the needle and harness the support for the goals that I think are useful, but not turn over power to people who would basically just want to create a right-leaning version of progressivism where they've abandoned the rule of law, they've abandoned the concept of objective truth that we're reaching for and natural rights and all of this in favor of just using the tools of progressivism to enact a more culturally conservative vision.
You're absolutely correct. I don't think that everything he does is consistent with what we would want. So you can definitely criticize him there. And I'd say that when it comes to criticism, when it comes to this sort of cult-like desire that he occasionally have, and he does have a big ego. Let's not say.
Oh yes,
yes, right. I think it's as important as ever to try to react against this culture, and it's as important as ever for people to start, speaking up their ideas and resist this in order to send him the message across that this is not who we are as a people. Well, when it comes to what he's doing, I don't think that this form of demand for, let's say, endless loyalty is going to be particularly helpful. But at the end of the day, he doesn't even. Everyone who governs wants people who are loyal to them around them. That doesn't mean necessarily that they want yes men, but people they want. So the question is, what is his response? What is his reaction to people who he considers to not be loyal to him? And I'd say that even if we accept that the term illiberal for him in this case, I think that the fate that awaits people who he considers to be disloyal to him isn't the equivalent of the fate that awaits people who are deemed disloyal by leaders of very liberal regimes. So he isn't killing them. He isn't in a way completely debanking them or something. It's just like say, I don't want you in my administration. And he turns their back on them. Sometimes he do it in a crass way. Sometimes he doesn't. Occasionally it's fun. But one of the things I want to raise here, and I want to hear your opinion about it, is that there's another criticism I had years ago of this. It seems to me that one of the criticisms of Trump I have is that it seems to me that he missed a golden opportunity to become a more unifying president. And in a way, he is the main beneficiary of TDS. Why? This happens for several reasons. Now, for instance, the madman theory, the more plausible it is, and the more people think that he is mad, the more he's able to use that in negotiations.
Yes.
So in a way, he is a beneficiary, one of the main beneficiaries of TDS. Was it James Melville who went out and started screaming and said that I want to hate him about a month ago? Yeah. So he's one of the main beneficiaries of TDS. But that has a very negative side in culture. The way I look at it, and it may be from an outsider's perspective because I didn't live through these times in the US, but the way I think about it is that Obama comes along in his second term and he takes all the crazy grievance narratives from the universities and he brings them to the mainstream, and he poisons the American civil society and American culture with this victimhood narratives and victimhood Olympics, and where everyone is screaming at each other at how oppressed they are and how much they are oppressed by tradition and traditional American society. And there comes Hillary Clinton comes along, and with all the TDS she was giving a voice to, and she loses the election. And at that point, he had a golden opportunity to show the Americans that the Democrats had a very radicalized chapter in their history. They lost their party to it. They lost their election because they lost their party to the radicals. And I'm going to be a more unifying president from now on. Instead, I don't think he did this. I think he already won. He had already won, and he didn't do it. And he could have done it. And I think that this had a very bad influence in culture, which it's occasionally funny here or there, but he isn't like Reagan in that he is a great communicator who will be absolutely convinced that he has the best argument and he's going to articulate it and he is going to send the message across that, guys, everyone on your best behavior. He set a more, if you'd like, crass temperament, and whoever's president is sort of setting the tone for the moral life of the nation, but also the Western world, because people have the tendency to really look up to whoever is very powerful. And it seems to me that the lack of argumentation, he's partly to blame for the radicalization of US society and for the lack of argumentation in it. I don't think he cast the first stone, but I blame him with not taking the first opportunity to stop this and bring things back to normal.
Yeah, I agree with you that I don't think he made even the attempt to do this, right? So that, though there was an interesting moment in one of his addresses to Congress where, traditionally, even a president of the opposing party, if there are certain things that everyone agrees on, and we say God bless the troops, right? And both sides of the House stand up for that one, even if only one side applauses for more partisan divisions. And he said something that should have gotten a bipartisan response, and it didn't. And he stopped his address and said, I'm paraphrasing, but he said, I understand what's happening now. There's nothing I can do that will make you cheer. And I will remember that. And I think that he's right about that, but I don't think he made the effort, which is maybe a complicated response to what you just said. And I think that the challenge and the reason it's referred to as a culture war, which is dramatic, but maybe not overly dramatic, is that there is a real fight for what it means to be American right now. And I think that it's the same fight in Europe, just with a different cultural reference point. And it's a fight that is worth winning. And I think what he has realized over time correctly is what I realized over time correctly. So just to give you my own story, I was a unthinking, reflexive Democrat my entire life. So I grew up in a Democratic household. I voted left. I was an educator. This is everyone I knew was on the left. I voted for everybody. This is just who I was. I went to law school. I had a child. I was exposed to conservative thought for the first time. Read Justice Scalia and said, "Oh my God, what have I been doing?" And slowly over time, this led me to the right. But first, it led me to centrism. And it led me to centrism because I thought, these people, the people I've been voting with my whole life, they must not know about what they're doing. I'm going to go tell them. And this is actually what I started doing when I started speaking publicly on the internet. I would go into left spaces and I'd say, wait, hold on. Constitutional originalism better upholds our classic liberal tradition. The originalists are right. The living constitutionalists, this is progressive nonsense. All these things that we're doing, these are mistakes. We just have to stop doing these things, and we'll stop the ascendancy of the right because we're making these mistakes. And what I quickly realized is that all of my friends and family on the left either don't care about these issues at all, or they know about these issues and they are doing it on purpose. It is not an accidental rejection. It is a purposeful rejection, which ultimately led me to the right. And this is the reason why I've become more supportive of Trump despite the fact that he has all these traits I dislike, because I don't know that there's a middle ground, unfortunately, on some of these issues. Because I've said to people in some conversations I've had with people on the left, where I said, okay, if you believe Trump is uniquely bad, you think Trump is awful, you think he's a unique threat to the West and our way of life, people on the right like him. What concessions will you make to avoid his victory? Will you give up packing the court with liberal justices? Will you give up equity instead of equality of opportunity? Will you give up baking, trans-inclusive speech into government programs? What will you give up in order to combat this threat? And the answer is nothing. Nothing. They will give up nothing. And
That
that's very difficult for me to reckon with.
that's the effect of ideology, because ideologues want to view it in terms of an all or nothing thing, whereas realists are more realistic, and they view politics in terms of trade-offs, and they aren't that much interested in the notion of a sort of final end state in this world. They look at this world as an ongoing thing, and therefore any sort of culture as being in constant cultural warfare, which doesn't necessarily have to disintegrate into the use of arms. So I would definitely say that that's a major poison in the foundations of society. This notion of ideology and absolute goodness versus absolute evil on the one hand in this world. That's why I criticize him and also blame him when it came to this, because that gave the opportunity also to the Democrats to have more of an introspective chance, a chance at introspection, say, right, guys, we were ridiculous. We were saying this guy was going to be Hitler. Turns out he wasn't Hitler. He didn't kill people. He didn't genocide people. So maybe let's keep our extremists at bay. They didn't do this. And one of the things is that he played along with it. And the issue is that the narrative for a long time now is that the center cannot hold. And when the narrative is that the center cannot hold, then you have the extremes who are battling each other, and they're trying to convince everyone that, well, the center doesn't hold, we are inevitable, join us, and let us make the preemptive strike, because we're in constant warfare against the other. We're existential enemies. Unless we strike first, we're going to be the first victims. They look at it in terms of a Schmittian friend-enemy distinction, where the enemy is going to be exterminated. And that's incredibly poisonous in society. And I would say this is going to sound incredibly naive here, but I think that the only solution to this is a return to the following kind of normalcy, a sort of bipartisan cooperation with respect to keeping crackpots at bay on both sides. If this doesn't happen, I don't see how things can get better. I don't buy into the narrative of civil war on a grand scale. I do think things move to the wrong direction, but I don't buy into the imminent, everything's going to break, civil war is going to break any moment now. I do think, though, that there are sides that definitely want to communicate this narrative in order to further radicalize US society and play divide and conquer, to split the Western camp. It's definitely the case that the major geopolitical rivals of the US do want to promote this kind of anti-Westernism and this sort of, which manifests in this divide and conquer strategy. So it seems to me that there has to be bipartisan collaboration in this, and both sides have to keep their radicals at bay.
Yeah, and I think this is
I don't see any other way, because unless both do this, they are giving the argument to the other side. And we see them frequently agreeing on certain issues. As of late, both disagree with respect to classical liberal institutions. Both agree on rejecting classical liberal institutions.
This is the danger, I think, of introducing postmodernism and post-structuralism into society, which I view as a dramatically destabilizing force. because in a world where everyone is entitled to their own truth about what is happening, and under that worldview, you of course are entitled to it, there is no center, right? And what we're seeing now is, I have some friends who I think are otherwise, smart and capable people, and I'll ask them, what is their view of modern politics, and they're quite on the left, and they'll say something like, a moderate leftist response to this current presidency is that when the left regains power, they should have a Truth and Reconciliation Committee, which goes after everybody who supported him. And we should pack the Supreme Court with justices to create a majority, thus that we can reverse all the disastrous decisions of the last few years. And this is, of course, not at all a moderate response to anything. This is an extraordinarily anti-liberal and extreme response, but it's framed as if it was moderate because they do not view the classical liberal tradition as the center. They view the progressive tradition of the last 50 years as the center, and they view any attempt to reverse some of those excesses as intrusion into their victories over time. This is, I find very challenging because, to go back to the very beginning of our conversation, if we don't agree on what the cultural center is, it's very difficult to even tell who the crackpots are.
Yes, correct. And I would say that this is one of the main reasons why I'm attracted to classical liberalism, because if we look at the history of the tradition and focus on each thinker and what sort of argument they gave on each context, is that it arose as a reaction to absolutism. So what we see here is both sides, and this is far more dangerous to the left, opting for absolutism. Mm-hmm. So they will talk about, modern society and progressivism, but going back to the times before the modern state isn't progress. That's massive regress. And they are trying to justify absolutism in their minds in terms of, the short-term dictatorship of the proletariat or of the university students, mm-hmm. which is going to usher in the new utopia after the first 5-year plan. So essentially, I think that this comes with a spirit of excess, a spirit that lacks humility. It's a blasphemous outlook in a way. And these are people who are so much consumed by their anger and resentment, who think that their anger justifies in them doing anything. That's why they are constantly waging a war on standards. And one of the things I utterly reject is this idea that there should be no standards, that you are going to hold members of whatever your side is supposed to be. Mm-hmm. Acting like the left isn't a good thing for those on the right. I constantly hear from people saying, well, the left doesn't have any limits and they win election. No, they lost let's say in the US. They lost their party. So the very idea of, I'd say, whenever you listen to people waging warfare on the very idea of standards, and they're telling you to look the other way when members of whatever your side is supposed to be are advocating for heinous crimes when it comes to, and they are justifying them in terms of their anger and mm-hmm. whatever they consider to be necessary for winning the war or whatever they think about it, I'd say run or try to marginalize them. Because what happens is that, and this is something we need to start talking about, because we constantly listen to people talking about don't punch right. Mm-hmm. and don't gatekeep. This is absolutely contradictory. Everyone gatekeeps. The question is who holds the keys to the gate. Very frequently, it's the very people who are arguing against gatekeeping and the necessity for gatekeeping who are constantly hiding behind these argumentation in order to constantly blame others as not being truly right and having the privilege of marginalizing them and waging war against them, themselves saying that they shouldn't be criticized because they are allegedly on their side. It's like double standard. It's I'm going to criticize you and you're going to not criticize me.
Yeah, rule for thee, not for me is the is very typical in these contexts. And but by the way, I know we've been going for 2 hours. Yes. I want to just check in about you on timing. I could spend another 30 minutes to an hour if you would like, or we could wrap up now, whatever works for you.
I think another 20, 30 minutes would be awesome.
Okay, great. So I know we have a few questions from chat that I'd like to cover, but we started talking on philosophy. We've talked a little bit about modern politics as well. I think one of the things that in the last chunk of time I'd like to talk to you about is the idea a bit of memes and the modern need to express ideas in this new format. And the way that people, the way I articulate this to people is that, people who grew up reading books think in paragraphs. People who grew up reading emojis do not. They think in a different way. And I don't think that you can put the toothpaste back in the tube. So one project that I've been trying to think about is how do you take a complex idea like classic liberalism with a lot of nuance and simplify it into slogans and emojis and memes and the kind of ideas that are viral today, while still signposting to the rich tradition, right? Because you're going to lose something when you go low resolution like this. You're not going to have all the detail, but you want to be able to lead people if you capture their attention back to the correct sources. So I guess what are the catchy ideas, the core elevator pitches, the memes of classic liberalism that you think might catch on today that could get someone interested in the tradition who maybe doesn't know much about it?
Right. So I'd say, first of all, I love memes.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with what you're saying about the paragraphs. I think, though, that the context isn't quite the same because memes are very funny and pithy, but they are mostly fun, you could say. So they aren't necessarily intended to educate. So I wouldn't necessarily draw this comparison. But I do think that there are implications there we can draw from and talk about fragmentation. And there very frequently is an issue with fragmentary information. We are limited beings. We are not omniscient. So all of us have a partial access to the truth. But what we should try to do is try to expand our intellectual horizons and try to take more things into account than less things. Now, when it comes to memes, I think that the memes are the best when they are mocking something.
Mm-hmm.
So I wouldn't necessarily try to capsulize the classical liberal tradition in memes alone. Memes are usually meant to mock something. So it's usually, if you were to go for it, I think the way to go for it would be to have a Chad meme as opposed to a stupid meme, a Wojak or a crying.
The Chad classic liberal.
Yes. Everyone wants Chad to be for them. So I think that would be the way to do it.
Yeah. So the challenge that I see often in this new information landscape, right, is I think Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. In the last presidential election, speaking of something I criticized Trump for, he and J.D. Vance repeated that there were Haitians that were eating cats and dogs and other animals in various communities, which was demonstrably false, right?
Okay.
Now, but what it did was it drew attention to mass migration, and it drew attention to various programs that have allowed for temporary protected status on a refugee basis. But these programs went into effect in 98, 96, and they've been going for 30 years. So nothing is more permanent than a temporary government program. Yet still, these programs exist, and as a result, we've had, some people give stats that, like, under the Biden administration, something like 5 or 6% of the population of Haiti immigrated to the United States during those. So this is a huge, huge number of people. So I give this example because this is not what I want to do. I don't like it when the attention getting is false or somehow untrue. But by having something that they're eating cats and dogs, it's so visceral. It focuses the population, and all of a sudden people who aren't otherwise engaged are engaged. So it was politically very successful. And this is, I think, a challenge, because one of the great ways to get attention online, as you referenced earlier, is to lie. But if you're going to impose, as classic liberals must, these restrictions on yourself, there are things that we simply cannot do. So competing in the information landscape with a complex idea and a lot of self-imposed restrictions is very challenging. So I don't suppose you have a solution to this. This would be tremendously helpful if you did.
I think it comes into cycles. There are times where people are a bit fed up with low resolution information, and they want more high resolution information. Mm-hmm. And there are many times where people don't have the time, and they just want to scroll down and look at funny things. I don't know to what extent people who want to form a very sophisticated opinion about political philosophy do it on X. So when it comes to X and memes, it would have to be mostly contemporary politics and following the news cycle. Not every message is tailored for everyone. When, for instance, I think that Hayek was one of the most influential, let's say, classical liberals. I can't see him as being very memey. Mm-hmm. But I can see other people having a very strong skill with memes.
Yeah.
So this could be seen not necessarily as a one-man army thing. This could be seen as a collaborative effort where, there are some people whose expertise is more intellectual, and they're much better in talking with arguments that are sophisticated and are intended to convince the sophisticated, undecided interlocutor. There are other people who are following the news cycle, and you can't do both very well. And I include myself on that, which may sound a bit of a cell phone, but it's both are 24/7 occupations. And it's very difficult to do both.
It is. It draws to mind like someone like Milton Friedman, who's very good on his feet. And I do think that increasingly there's going to be a value on kind of, to not to pat ourselves on the back for what we're doing now. The capacity to have, extemporaneous conversation, to talk about these things articulately, that people in a way that they value, but then also to have something pithy and to be able to go out, as people do. This is, I suppose, what Charlie Kirk was good at, was going out and having these moments where he was able to express his worldview in a way that would draw attention, and then people could zoom in to the level of depth that they were comfortable with or not. But ultimately, I think one of the things that we've agreed on is that if you don't want the government to decide what you should think, and we do not want that, then you must be engaged in a competitive marketplace of ideas. And, I think that for my profound criticism of the classic liberals of my era is that we have been very, very, I don't know, complacent, let's say, about this. We have been unassertive, and we have let people assert moral superiority when they have no right to it. They'll tell us that we are the ones who are doing the oppressing, when in fact we are the ones who want to remove the apparatus of oppression in the first instance. And we must be assertive in this area because we don't believe in the government enforcing this. The only way we can win the fight is culturally and is by articulating our ideas as best as we possibly can.
It's the only way. And let me just give you an example that I think will generate some optimism. There have been eras where there have been very few people arguing for classical liberalism, and very few people listened at the time, but they were vindicated down the line. I'm thinking of Ludwig von Mises, for instance, who was one of the very few voices for classical liberalism in the 1920s, when he was engaging into the social calculation debate with social democrats. And at the time, many people, I think even Hayek, were leftists. And he convinced them, and down the line, he has created a massive school surrounding his name, which carries on to this day and will carry on in the future. So it seems to me that people will appreciate down the line the fact that individuals such as ourselves and others are trying to give this fight right now, and we are willing to take the hits, and we are going to power through, and it becomes courageous. So, for instance, I'll just say lots of people are afraid online of pylons, and they're getting attacked all the time, and they have people sending them death memes and stuff. And so you get this all the time. At some point, you get used to it. It's mostly, just people blowing some steam off. I think we need to power through, and we need to become more and more sophisticated, because in a sense, when lies travel fast, when you're trying to expose the lie, it takes time. But eventually it can happen. And this is a theme throughout humanity. It's that it's ingrained into the idea that eventually people get their just desserts. Now, sadly, I think there are exceptions to this. But if you think that the universe is sort of governed by divine providence, or things, generally speaking, do have a side where, rationality tends to win down the line, there are eras, let's say, where lies and the unjust seem to be winning because they haven't yet got their just desserts. Sadly, Stalin was an exception here. He didn't get his just desserts while he was alive. And yeah, I can totally appreciate this if you want to bring me an example against this. But it seems to me that it's easy to spread lies. But one of the good things that I see happening right now is that when people are very much online, they don't have one reaction. One reaction is for them to be just completely and cult-like and enter cults. The other is that they start to notice people who flip-flop. So it seems to me that we have to power through and constantly expose the various threats, but also the misrepresentation of classical liberalism. Because I know but post-liberals are misrepresenting classical liberals as much as they're breathing.
And endlessly. Yeah,
they're just saying things like classical liberalism has no principles of limitation, or classical liberalism is infused by the blasphemous Promethean spirit. In both cases, it's the exact opposite.
A tremendous example of this from my life is, I told you Justice Scalia was tremendously influential in my growth and political transformation, and he was for many people because he did exactly what you just talked about. Especially in his dissents, he wrote in a catching, articulate style for law students because he was trying to create a generation of originalist thinkers who would preserve this classical liberal idea. And one of the things that he pointed out that it really moved me tremendously was when you think of a constitutional right, this hadn't occurred to me till he said it, everyone thinks of it as a great thing. Oh, you have this right now. Isn't it wonderful? You have this right. You have this wonderful thing that you can enforce. But a constitutional right is just something that's been removed from the democratic process and the people no longer can vote on, which is fine if the people removed it. But if the judges and the bureaucrats create it on their own without the imprimatur of the people, that is not democratic. That is anti-democratic. That is, in fact, a removal of democracy from the people by an unelected official, which ought not be done. These restrictions ought to be imposed by the people, not the other way around. And this opened my eyes because, of course, when you hear a progressive lawyer talk about it, they say, oh, these are rights. And when we have more rights, we have more progress. And of course, this is, of course, a good thing. So I totally agree with you, and this has been tremendously influential in my thoughts. Do you have time for a few short questions from the audience, or no? You've been very generous. Yeah. Well, first of all, you just have a few fans. You had grassroots hegemon at property rights, and
grassroots hegemon.
So this guy is pretty based, says Chipingro. So there's a bunch of people here who just love you and support what you're doing. And by the way, Brazufso, I didn't say thank you. I appreciate the memberships, the support for the stream. It's tremendously beneficial to me. Thank you so much. But a few questions. Owlishness asked, elaborate on the college thing. This seems insane. The college itself being liberal has nothing to do with the people studying there. Making assumptions about them due to it is a form of discrimination. And I'd invite your thoughts on this. My take, and I'll do it as short as I can, is that this is the sort of progressive issue, and I know she is quite progressive, that drives me insane, where they say, you as a liberal are obligated not to discriminate against me for my bad ideas. And of course, there is no better basis to discriminate against somebody than their bad ideas. That is the most just reason to discriminate against somebody, in my opinion. But I would ask you, Stelios, what do you think about this?
Well, first of all, the very act of thinking involves sort of categorization. You describe things in terms of concepts, which means you describe things as something. And that involves a form of discrimination. When it comes, though, to I want to address the other point, though. I don't want to focus just on the word. It's, in a way, I agree. It doesn't have much to do with the people who study there. And I will also say something that is a bit optimistic in the way I see it. That in some respects, it doesn't even have to do with the majority of people who work there. The way I've experienced it, it's much more an issue of a bureaucratic few, a top-down imposed form of bureaucracy. So that's something I see there. And one of the very bad things that I have to say about wokeness, and here it may surprise people who are progressives here, is that it seems to me that it's also a war that, forgive me for saying, white people use against other white people. What do I mean? I was in a department where it was in humanities. And when the people who carry on in academia are very few, there's a very small number in the humanities who carry on. And what happened was that after a while, out of the 30, let's say, who were there, who understood that one or two people would carry on, after some people understood that they couldn't stand out with their own research, They started accusing others who were better than them as being racist. And that's a tremendously bad thing that destroys culture in a very sneaky way. Why? Because when it has to do with woke legislation and rules, they're incredibly subjective. When it comes to rules and laws like don't kill and don't steal, there are publicly accessible criteria we can appeal to in order to verify whether a particular law has been violated. When it comes to offense, there is no such thing. So we can have a perennial discussion about the matter. There is no such thing as saying case is closed. This person didn't kill that person, or they didn't steal, or they did. There's no such thing with that in departments. So yeah, I would say that it doesn't require a majority of people in order to change culture. And this has its pros and cons. It can be sometimes very few people who can completely take over institutions. And I would say if the owlishness is a Democrat and counts themselves as being a Democrat, I'd say, well, they should reflect on this. And I don't mean this in terms of, I'm not saying they're existential enemy or something. And that they should reflect on this, because presumably they don't want to be members of a party that has been consumed by radicals. And this sort of culture doesn't require a maturity in order to be imposed, and actually have a very negative effect on people who are there in that institution, but also in the wider culture.
Well, and also this is, one of the things that happens is that institutions and people develop reputations, right? So yes, I see what she's saying when she says it's discrimination, but I'm not suggesting I would never hire someone from a university I considered woke. What I'm saying is if they were trained in a way that I find somewhat suspect, they would need to demonstrate to me that they do not think in a way that I find reprehensible in order for me to overcome my suspicion about the reputation of the institution that educated them. And it is insane to ask people to turn a blind eye to the reputation of various institutions, in the same way that it's insane in Europe when people say, you should not at all consider what the ramifications of importing huge numbers of people who, if given the opportunity, will vote for Sharia law is on a society. Well, you actually do know what the reputation is, and this is not a illogical thing for a person to consider. It is a thing they must consider. Now, that doesn't mean they have to be biased and close their eyes and not treat people as individuals. Of course, we must treat people as individuals, but that treating someone as an individual includes accounting for their reputation. It does not mean turning a blind eye to everything about this person, which I find that drives me a little bit insane. But Chipingro had another question for you. Ask Stelios, thank you, Chipingro, for the 5, how we maintain our standards and principles while reasserting ourselves into places like academia, please.
Right. I don't see how there's a contradiction there. We can try and reassert ourselves in academia without violating our principles. I wouldn't say that trying to form communities necessarily violates our principles. On the other hand, maybe, because I don't want to be, I don't want to dismiss the question. Maybe the question is whether we would turn a blind eye to people, whether we're just going to hire just classical liberals. I mean, that's not necessarily what I meant there, because it seems to me that what we have to do is to essentially fight against this bureaucratic top-down imposition by a few and allow people room to breathe. It's not that classical liberals don't exist in academia. It's that, there are much fewer than there are Marxists. But it seems to me that they have an issue with the bureaucracy as much as more than anything else. So the form of there are people who are saying, right, let's fire all the political dissenters and hire our guys, irrespective of whether they are good or bad. As I said before, I am for holding people who I consider to be friends on high standards, because I think this is what friends do. One of the ways in which friends stand for each other during difficult times is by exerting a positive force to them. So that wasn't exactly what I meant. What I meant before was try to dismantle the influence of the very negative influence of this bureaucracy by a few people, and also allow room for the others to breathe.
Yeah, as you were explaining this, an example came to mind, which I think might be helpful to unpack, because I think this is a difficult question on some level. So in America, we've had a lot of discussion about the universities and the long march through the institutions, et cetera. We talked about it today. President Trump targeted the universities by withholding funding for research programs and other federal money that was going to the universities unless they reformed and had hired different professors and combated woke ideology and X, Y, and Z different things, right? Now, this is very complicated for me because on one hand, I don't actually want the federal government funding the universities in the first place. So withholding the funding doesn't concern me that much. I wish this lever of power didn't exist. And I do wish the universities were going to be reformed. But if they're going to be reformed, I don't really want them being reformed by top-down government pressure. That's not exactly the tool that I would call fit for purpose, right? So I'm torn because there's many things about the policy that I actually quite like, but then on other aspects of it, I say, oh, is that really in keeping with my values to have the federal government trying to dictate to a university who they hire and what they teach?
Well, if he's withholding funding. I don't see how he is, in a way he says, well, I'm not going to help you. He isn't actively doing something that is going to what should I say? It's more like allowing something bad to happen to them than actually doing it.
He's not big jailing them.
Yeah, because there's a big question on whether there should be federal funding, especially when it comes to an agenda that is explicitly anti-American and anti-Western. So I think that when there are people who say my goal is to destroy you, why should they receive funding? Why should people fund the very people who say that their goal is to destroy them?
This is a fair question. I think, and I think a good place to end, because that is in many ways where we are culturally. Like, are we in the business of having the government fund the people who are then going to come up with new ways to attack the ideology the government is supposed to protect? Stelios, I have tremendously enjoyed this. I was looking forward to this for weeks, and it lived up to my expectations in every way. I really appreciate you and your time. If you were watching this today live, I know this is early for my audience, but and particularly if you watch it later, please do find Stelios, subscribe, watch the podcast for the Lotus Eaters, and help us grow the alliance of classic liberals across the Atlantic so that we can push these ideas forward. Stelios, I'd like to give you the last word if there's anything you'd like to say to the audience or where they can find you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for this. I absolutely enjoyed it. And as I said before, it was a breath of fresh air. And I very much respect your audience, and very much respect you, Ryan. And thank you very much. It has been an absolute pleasure. And we should definitely do what you're saying.
Yes, please. Let's stay in touch and do this again sometime soon. This has really been tremendous. Well, thank you so much, Stelios, for dropping by, and I hope we have many collaborations in the future.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Have a good one.
You too. Thanks.